AIDS Challenge 14 of the 2022 Holiday Hack Challenge. This is exploitation via AWS CLI or AWS 201, if I remember correctly on the terminal name. And this is going to be a bit longer because this is the final challenge to get the cloud ring, but you will see that it's still fairly easy. So let's go and solve the challenge. So we left off with the truffle hog search, and this challenge actually builds on top of the AWS CLI intro and the truffle hog search one, so much that hopefully you saved the output of truffle hog, because you're gonna need those credentials for the next part. But first, we need to talk to Gertie here. Let's just click through the discussion here, and she's going to not only give us the challenge, but also hints for that challenge. Let me just scroll here. So there it is, exploitation via AWS CLI. She's going to give hints for this challenge, all good. And then on the hints part, we have to look for AWS CLI 201. And it's going to tell us about inline policies. So you can read, these are basically policies attached to an individual identity. And then privilege escalation, Chris's talk on, well, AWS CLI usage and how you could leverage that during a penetration test. To be frank, I peeked into the challenge and then I kind of skipped going through Chris's talk, but I do intend to circle back. But the terminal in this case is very, very helpful. So that's all pretty much that you need in order to solve this challenge. And to jump around here, it's a little bit annoying. I think it's intentional. And the terminal is all the way up here, next to this spork. His name is Salford. Lex is here a little bit. I don't think this spork is interesting from the point of the terminal here. So let's click on the terminal and let's get started. All right, so this tells you immediately to configure the credentials and then run the get caller identity. This was basically the command, the last command that you had to execute with the AWS CLI intro or 101 challenge. And you do need the truffle hog credentials, which I do have it in my notes. If you would like to know how to get them, then check out the previous video in the playlist. And this gave us a file that contained credentials. A sec. I'm just going to copy these real quick into the terminal. Yeah, push it to JSON, and then the last piece, running get caller identity. All right, so you can see for the ARN, which is a unique identifier for AWS resources, that this is an actual user called Hog, I think. This is a G, not a Q. And the next step is to figure out what we can do with this identity, with these credentials. That's really a common way to do this exploitation. So if there are exposed API keys, like in this case, then an attacker would do this next step on currying the AWS AMI to figure out the capabilities of those credentials, the privileges that it has. So the obvious choice will be to list out the policies. And the challenge also gives us a link on the AMI command, and also tells us that this is not the list user policies. It is some sort of list, it's just not user policies. So probably the other way around is policy, and then try to figure it out that way. I do know the answer here. I just want to show you how you could potentially find this. So one of the list commands here. Because it's policies, not policy. So we have list policies and then list attached user policies. Okay, so it's a little bit tricky, but eventually you would be able to figure this one out. And the one parameter that is mandatory is the username. I already have the command here cooked up. All right, we'll just clear this one. So from the ARN that we already know that this is the username, and we're just going to do AWS AMI, and then the command is list attached user policies. And this tells us that we have one policy attached, which based on the ARN, is AWS resource number. You also see the name here, but the policy name is also something that is available here. Now we need to figure out what this policy actually does. And again, here, if you search for get user policy, you will see that you would need the name of the oh, sorry, that's another step here. I'm skipping one step here. But first, let's just do a get policy. And then we will also get the policy version. So first, we just want to figure out what the policy does. And that requires the ARN. I think I just stick to the nodes that I created. So get policy, and then you just take the ARN here. And this tells you the default version. This will have a significance and details about the policy. If you would like to see what actually is the various policy versions that are available, you could try to do the list policy versions here. This one we do not have sufficient privileges to run. So instead, we can go and once again under IAM, we can get the policy version for this policy. We need to define the version ID and the ARN. This one had v1 as the default. So let's create a v1. So this is AWS AM get policy version, the ARN, and then the version ID, which is v1 in this case. And you probably want to pipe that actually to less so that you can review. So this is a standard AWS AIM policy description with the effect action resources. I don't know if there are any constraints or optional things here. So these are just the mandatory ones. So this policy that is attached to this user has the privileges to list Lambda functions and get the URL config for the Lambda function. That's going to be the end goal here, to figure out the name of Lambda function and then get the policy, the URL policy. We also have the privileges to get user policy, list user policies, list attached user policies. So that's for inline, and then get policy versions, and also for S3 we can do a get object, and for Lambda invoke. API calls are also enabled for this user. Alrighty, so next we're going to look at inline policies. So that was the goal here with all that. So inline policies are policies that are unique to a user or any particular identity for that matter. Can be also a resource. And the list attached user policies was what we used previously, and this is going to be just the list user policies, which requires again a username. Let's do that. Again, AWS AIM, list user policies. And we have one inline policy here, S3 permissions. Oops. We don't want to have an emoji here. Not now. So we need to get user policy. This is what I was mixing up here. So this requires a username and a policy name. And this is for inline policies. So there's a separate API call for inline. Let me just delete this. So there it is. These are the privileges provided. We can list objects on these resources, which are S3 bucket, smog machines, apparently. Smog machines are free, to be more precise. And now we are being tasked to list the objects within this using the S3 API command. Now, if you ever use the CLI, there's also the S3 commands, and S3 API is just a different way to interact with S3 buckets. So as you can see, you can also put list and all the good stuff there. So in terms of listing policies, listing objects here, we have two options, interestingly, list object and list objects v2. However, if you look at it here, it's just list objects that we have sufficient privileges to do. So if you try to do something like list object v2, because you read like, this is the one that is recommended and the other one is kind of considered deprecated, it's still in use, and this is the one that we have sufficient privileges. So instead of the v2 one, we're just going to use the standard list objects. And again, you probably want to pipe it to less so that you're able to review the objects here. You want to look at the key, which will tell you the file name. So these are images, or JPEG, and a Python script here, smog machine, lambda, handler, and then some random string there. Alrighty, and the task here is to figure out all the lambda functions that are accessible for this credential. So that would be again another list command, and you can do the same thing with the AWS help. I just find this one a bit faster. So list functions requires us nothing. We just do AWS Lambda list functions. And there's again plenty of output here for this tiny terminal here. So there's the smog machine lambda function with all its details. And the last thing that we've been tasked is to get the configuration of the public URI, which is going to be URL and then config. And we want to have a get function. So this one here, which requires a function name, and that one we already had. So it was the smoke machine underscore lambda. And this is the last command that we need to execute. Solve the challenge. But that's it. The final goal was to figure out and get the configuration details for this lambda function, starting off with an accidentally added AWS credentials. And we have our achievement listed here. A new narrative. Into clouds, Grisham had the 4th throne. And under objectives, now we have the cloud ring with the little cloud and wind symbols. So all that's left is the burning ring of fire. Altogether, this was a pretty straightforward challenge. I totally forgot to check the difficulty level. Let me just go back. So difficulty level for this one is 3 Christmas trees. I think that's realistic. So there is a significant amount of documentation reading involved if you never use these functions. If you master the AWS CLI, you probably had no problems with this challenge, especially because it's very nicely guided, but it does demonstrate a very realistic scenario. So I like that a lot. All right. With that, we only have one more ring to collect, which is the burning ring of fire. So please join me in the next 3 videos when we're going to solve the remaining 3 challenges for the 2022 Holiday Hack Challenge.